The champagne glass hit the marble floor before anyone saw it fall. Grace didn't flinch. She just knelt down, slow and quiet, and started picking up the pieces with her bare hands while 30 pairs of eyes watched her like she was furniture that had finally moved. "Leave it," Mrs. Park said, laughing into her drink. "She's used to being on her knees anyway." Nobody in that room knew her real name. Not the one that mattered. And in about 4 minutes, the man walking through those double doors was going to make every single one of them wish they'd never learned it either. If you're watching this from your kitchen, your car, your bed at midnight because you couldn't sleep, comment your city below. I want to know where this story's finding you tonight. Now let's get into it. Grace Williams had been the Choi family's nanny for 6 years. And in 6 years, she had never once raised her voice in that house. She woke before the sun, made little Mina's lunch with the crusts cut off just how she liked, and walked her and her brother June to the car every morning with a warmth that felt like it came from somewhere deep, somewhere earned. The children loved her the way children love the people who actually see them. Not the way they loved their parents' money. The way they loved someone who knelt down to their height and asked how their day really was. But there were things about Grace that didn't add up, if anyone had bothered to look closely. Like the way she stood near doorways, never with her back to them. The way her eyes moved across a crowded room before her body did. Cataloging exits the way most people catalog outfits. The way, 3 weeks ago, when a delivery man reached too fast into his jacket for a pen, her hand had moved half an inch toward her hip before she caught herself and smiled instead. Nobody noticed. That was the point. "Miss Grace." Mina tugged her sleeve one morning. Her small face serious in that particular way 6-year-olds get serious. "Why do you talk different when you're on the phone? Like in Korean different." Grace smiled and tucked a strand of the girl's hair behind her ear. "Everybody's got more than one voice inside them, baby. You'll understand that when you're older." "Is it a secret voice?" "Something like that." She said it soft like a lullaby, and Mina let it go the way children do. Quick to wonder, quicker to move on to the next thing. But Grace's chest had tightened for just a second. Because the truth was closer to the surface than it had been in 15 years. And she could feel it, the way you feel weather changing before the clouds even show up. The Choi family's New Year gala was the biggest event on their social calendar, and this year Mrs. Choi had insisted Grace be there. Not to work exactly, but to help keep the children settled among the chaos of 200 guests, caterers, and a string quartet nobody was actually listening to. "You'll be family tonight," Mrs. Choi told her, squeezing her hand. "Wear something nice." Grace appreciated the kindness. She always had. Mrs. Choi was one of the good ones, the kind who remembered Grace's birthday, who asked about her knees when the weather turned. But kindness from one person in a room doesn't always protect you from the cruelty of the rest of it. Mrs. Park arrived at 8, dripping in diamonds and a perfume that announced her before she did. She was old money married into newer money, the kind of woman who measured her worth by how small she could make other people feel. "Oh," she said, when she first spotted Grace near the dessert table straightening napkins. "I didn't realize the help got invited to mingle now." "Grace is wonderful with the children," Mrs. Choi said gently, appearing at her side like a shield. "She's practically family." Mrs. Park's smile didn't move, but something behind her eyes did. "How sweet." Grace said nothing. She'd learned a long time ago that the loudest response to disrespect was often silence, because silence made people uncomfortable in ways shouting never could. Shouting gave them a fight to win. Silence gave them nothing to hold on to. But Mrs. Park wasn't the type to let nothing be enough. An hour later, with half the room now several drinks deep and the music louder, Mrs. Park found her again, this time with her son Ethan trailing behind her, phone already lifted, already recording. "Say something in Korean for us," Mrs. Park said, loud enough for the cluster of guests near her to turn and look. "Go on. I heard you speaking it to the kids earlier. Very impressive for a nanny." "I'd rather not perform," Grace said quietly, and kept walking toward the kitchen with a tray. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. "Careful," Mrs. Park said, stepping directly into her path, voice dropping into something sharper. "I don't think you understand who you're talking to." "I understand plenty," Grace said, and for just a second, 1 second, something moved behind her calm expression. Something old. Something that had survived worse rooms than this one. Mrs. Park's hand came up so fast nobody quite registered it until the tray was already falling, glass shattering across the marble, red wine splashing up the hem of Grace's dress like something out of a nightmare she'd had a long time ago, in a different life under a different name. The room went quiet. Then someone laughed, a nervous, ugly little laugh. And it spread the way ugly laughter does at parties where everyone's had too much to drink and not enough character. "Clean that up," Mrs. Park said, looking down at her, phone camera still rolling in her son's hand. "Isn't that literally your job?" Grace looked up at her. Not with anger. Not with tears. With something far more unsettling. A kind of stillness that made even Ethan lower his phone slightly. Some ancient instinct in him whispering that he just filmed something he shouldn't have. Grace knelt down anyway. Not because she was ashamed. Because she needed one more minute to think, to breathe, to let the old part of herself, the part she'd buried under 6 years of packed lunches and bedtime stories, decide exactly how this was going to end. Her phone buzzed once against her thigh, tucked in her cardigan pocket. She didn't need to look at it to know who it was. Only one person had that number. Only one person had ever needed to reach her that urgently, that specifically, at exactly this kind of moment. She read it anyway, glass still cutting faintly into her palm. Asterisk, he's 10 minutes out. He knows. Asterisk. For the first time all night, Grace smiled. And it wasn't the soft, warm smile the children knew. It was something colder. Something that hadn't been let out of its cage in a very long time. Mrs. Park didn't notice. She was too busy laughing with her friends, too busy feeling powerful in a room she thought she owned. She had no idea that the 10 minutes on that clock were the last 10 minutes her entire life would ever feel safe again. If this story's already got your heart racing, hit that like button right now and subscribe if you're new. Because what happens when that man walks through the door is going to change everything you think you know about this woman on her knees. Somewhere across town, a black SUV pulled off the freeway, moving fast through the wet streets, and in the back seat, a man named Doo-Han Choi was staring at his phone, at a single photo someone had just sent him. Grace, kneeling on broken glass, a room full of strangers laughing around her, and his jaw was tightening in a way his driver hadn't seen in almost a decade. "Faster," Doo-Han said quietly. The driver didn't ask questions. Nobody who worked for Doo-Han Choi ever did. Because whoever had done this to Grace Williams didn't understand yet what they had actually just humiliated. And by the time they did, it would already be far too late to take it back. The doors opened at exactly 9 minutes and 40 seconds. Doo-Han didn't storm in the way people storm into rooms in movies. He walked in slow, jacket still buttoned, hands calm at his sides, and somehow that was worse. The music didn't stop because anyone told it to. It just seemed to lose its nerve, fading under the weight of 4 men in dark suits fanning out behind him, eyes scanning the crowd like they were looking for something specific. They found it. Grace, still on her knees, wine soaking into the hem of her dress, glass glittering around her fingers. Doo-Han stopped walking. For a second, nobody in that room understood what they were looking at. This was Mr. Choi, the quiet investor who came to 2 parties a year and left before dessert. This was not a man who looked at anyone the way he was looking at Grace right now, like the floor had opened up under him. "Get her a chair," he said, not loud, but the kind of quiet that makes a room go instantly completely silent. Nobody moved. So he said it again, and this time his voice cracked just slightly at the edges. "Now." Mrs. Choi rushed forward with a napkin, kneeling beside Grace, but Doo-Han was already there, already crouched in front of her, already reaching for her hands like they were something precious that had been dropped and might still be salvaged. "Halmoni," he said softly. "Grandmother." The word landed in the room like a stone in still water. Mrs. Park's smile finally began to slip. "I'm fine," Grace said, and her voice, for the first time that night, wasn't the careful, measured voice of a nanny keeping the peace. It was warmer, rougher at the edges, tired in a way that made Doo-Han's eyes shine with something he was clearly fighting not to let fall. "You didn't have to come running like a fool in front of all these people. You think I was going to sit at home while somebody put their hands on you?" He said it low just for her, but the whole room was straining to hear anyway. "You raised me, Grace. You think I forgot that?" "I think," Grace said, letting him help her up, wincing slightly, "that you have a business dinner in 20 minutes and you're standing here making a scene over spilled wine." "It's not the wine," he said. "It's never been the wine." He turned then, slow, and looked at the room the way a judge looks at a courtroom before reading a verdict nobody's going to like. Does anyone here, he said, know who this woman is to me? Silence. Somewhere near the back, a waiter set down a tray so carefully it still made a sound that felt loud. She's the nanny, Mrs. Park said, though her voice had lost most of its earlier bite. Isn't she? Doo-Han almost laughed, except there was no humor anywhere in his face. She's the reason I'm alive to be standing in this room right now. She's the only person in 15 years who has never once lied to me. Never once asked me for anything. Never once left when things got dangerous enough that everyone else did. He paused, and his eyes moved slowly across the crowd, resting a moment too long on certain faces. She's the only person on this earth I trust completely. And tonight, in my sister's house at a party I paid for, somebody thought it was appropriate to make her bleed on the floor for entertainment. Doo-Han, Grace said gently, a hand on his arm. That's enough. It's not, he said. Not even close. He turned to Mrs. Park, and something in his expression made her take an actual physical step backward, heels catching slightly on the marble. You have 24 hours, he said. I'd use them wisely if I were you. Is that a threat? Her voice came out thinner than she wanted it to. No, Doo-Han said. A threat would be less generous. He looked back at Grace then, and his voice softened completely, like he'd stepped out of one version of himself and back into another. Tell me who you want handled first. I'll do whatever you say. You know that. Grace studied his face for a long moment. This man she had raised from a boy who cried himself to sleep after his mother died, into someone the whole city apparently walked carefully around. Nobody, she said finally. Grace. I said nobody, Doo-Han. Her voice carried the particular weight of someone who had earned the right to be obeyed. I didn't survive what I survived to watch you become the very thing I tried to protect you from. Sit down. Breathe. Let me handle this my way. He sat because that's what you did when Grace told you to sit. 20 years of instinct didn't disappear just because he'd grown 4 inches taller than her, and built an empire she'd never fully asked about. The next morning the video was everywhere. Not the humiliation video. That one had quietly disappeared from Ethan's phone sometime around midnight. Nobody quite sure how, though Doo-Han's men had been very polite about the whole thing. No, the video everywhere now was a different one. A grainy security clip from years earlier, resurfaced by someone in Doo-Han's circle, who clearly wanted the world to understand exactly who Grace Williams was. It showed a much younger Grace, hair different, posture sharper, standing between a 15-year-old Doo-Han and 3 armed men in an alley outside Seoul, negotiating in fluent Korean with a calm nobody in that alley had expected from her. The footage was shaky, poor quality, but her voice came through clear as anything. You'll have to go through me first. And trust me, that's not the fight you think it is. Grace watched it once on Mrs. Choi's tablet, over coffee the next morning, and shook her head slowly. I told them to destroy that tape, she muttered. Some things don't stay buried, Mrs. Choi said carefully, watching her friend with new eyes. Not fear exactly, but a kind of reverence that hadn't been there before. Grace, who are you? Really? Grace was quiet for a long moment, wrapping both hands around her mug like it was the only warm, steady thing in the room. I used to work for people who needed things kept quiet, she said finally. Very dangerous people on both sides of very dangerous lines. Doo-Han's mother was the only person who ever treated me like I mattered instead of like I was useful. When she died, I made a promise over her grave that her son would never walk through this world unprotected. I didn't plan on falling in love with being a nanny along the way. But I did. These last 6 years with your children, that's been the realest peace I've had in 30 years. If you're feeling this story in your chest right now, drop a comment telling me who in your life reminds you of Grace. Because we all know somebody who's been underestimated their whole life while quietly holding everything together. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe because what's coming in the next part is going to break your heart before it heals it. Mrs. Choi, Grace continued, quieter now, there's something else you should know. Something about who fed Mrs. Park the information to embarrass me last night. Because a stranger doesn't know to target me like that. Somebody in this house told her exactly where I'd be standing, and exactly when I'd have the tray in my hands. Mrs. Choi's face went pale. You think somebody set you up? I don't think, Grace said, setting her mug down slow and deliberate. I know. And by tonight, I'll know exactly who. Her phone buzzed on the counter between them. A single text from a number she hadn't seen in almost 2 decades. The kind of number that only ever meant one thing when it lit up her screen. We found him. After 20 years we finally found him. Grace's hand went still on the counter. Mrs. Choi watched the color drain slowly from her friend's face. Watched 30 years of careful composure crack for just a moment around the edges. "Grace," she said softly. "Who is he?" Grace didn't answer right away. She was staring out the kitchen window at nothing, at nowhere. At a version of her own past she thought she'd buried deep enough that it would never come looking for her again. "Someone I promised myself I'd face one day," she said finally, voice barely above a whisper. "I just never thought that day would actually come." The name he had once carried was Marcus Yoon, though Grace doubted he still used it. Men like him changed names the way other people change seasons. She sat with the phone in her lap for a long time after Mrs. Choi left the kitchen to check on the children, thumb hovering over the screen, not quite ready to type back. 20 years she had waited for this message. 20 years of small towns and careful silences, of watching every doorway, of choosing a quiet life raising other people's children because her own chance at that had been taken from her the night Marcus Yoon set fire to everything she'd built. Her sister had died in that fire. Grace had been the one who couldn't get to her in time. She typed one word back. "Where?" The answer came fast. An address downtown, a warehouse near the docks, the kind of place that only existed on maps that mattered to people like Doo-Han's organization. Doo-Han found her still sitting there 20 minutes later, phone now face down on the counter, hands folded like she was praying, though Grace hadn't prayed in longer than she could remember. "You're going," he said. It wasn't a question. "I have to." "Then I'm coming with you." Grace looked up at him, and for a moment she saw not the powerful man who commanded a room full of armed guards, but the 15-year-old boy who used to crawl into her lap after nightmares, asking her to promise nothing bad would ever happen to either of them again. "You have a family now, Doo-Han. Children who need their uncle whole and breathing. This isn't your fight. You made it my fight the day you stood in that alley for me," he said. "I don't care what you say. I'm not letting you walk into that building alone." She wanted to argue. She didn't have the strength left to. They arrived at the warehouse just after sundown, the sky bruising purple over the water, Doo-Han's men positioned quietly at every entrance, though Grace had insisted, actually insisted in a tone that made even hardened men listen, that nobody was to fire a single shot unless her life was in immediate danger. "This isn't about revenge," she told Doo-Han in the car. Hand steady even though her heart wasn't. "If I walk in there wanting blood, I become exactly what he made me almost become 20 years ago. I won't give him that. Not after everything it cost me to get free of it." Marcus Yoon was older now, grayer, smaller somehow than the monster she built in her memory. He sat in a folding chair in the center of an empty warehouse floor. Hands cuffed, 2 of Doo-Han's men flanking him, and when Grace walked in, something in his face genuinely broke. "Grace," he said, like her name still meant something to him. "You look well." "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't you dare pretend this is a reunion." "I think about her every day," he said, and his voice cracked in a way that almost made Grace's resolve waver. "Your sister. I never meant. You don't get to say her name." Grace's voice stayed level, but her eyes had filled, finally, after 20 years of holding it together for everyone except herself. "You don't get to stand there and make yourself the tragedy in this story." The warehouse was silent except for the distant sound of water against the docks outside. Doo-Han stood near the door watching, hands clenched at his sides, waiting for a signal that never came. "I'm not going to kill you," Grace said finally, and Marcus's shoulders sagged with something like relief, quickly replaced by confusion. "I thought about it for 20 years. What I'd do if I ever found you. But killing you would just be one more fire, Marcus. One more thing burning down because of what you started. I'm done building my life around what you took from me." "Then what?" "The police are already on their way," Grace said. "Every crime you've committed since that night, every name you've hidden behind, it's all documented. Doo-Han's people have been building the file for years, waiting for this exact moment. You're going to answer for what you did in a courtroom, in front of witnesses, in front of God. Not in some warehouse where I let my grief make the decision my sister deserved better than." Marcus stared at her, something between fear and disbelief flickering across his face, and for the first time in 2 decades, Grace felt something loosen in her chest that had been clenched tight since the night of that fire. Sirens sounded faintly in the distance, growing louder. "You could have ended this tonight," Doo-Han said quietly, walking up beside her as 2 officers led Marcus out in handcuffs. "Nobody would have questioned it." "I know," Grace said, watching the doors close behind him. "But I would have questioned it. Every single day for the rest of my life. Some debts aren't paid in blood, baby. Some debts are paid by refusing to become the person who hurt you." A few days later, life in the Choi household had quieted into something almost ordinary again, though nothing about that house would ever feel quite the same. Mrs. Park had disappeared from every social circle that mattered, her reputation unraveling faster than she could manage it, though Grace had asked, genuinely asked, that nothing worse be done to her. "Let her live with what she did," Grace told Doo-Han over dinner one evening, Mina asleep against her shoulder. "That's punishment enough for a woman who built her whole life on other people's smallness." Ethan, to everyone's surprise, showed up at the house one afternoon, nervous and stammering, and apologized to Grace directly, deleting every trace of that night from every device he owned while she watched, arms crossed, saying nothing until he was finished. "I didn't know who you were," he said quietly. "You didn't need to know who I was to know that what you were doing was wrong," Grace said. "That's the part one need you to understand. Not who I turned out to be. Who I already was kneeling there on that floor. Person. That should have been enough." If this story moved you even a little, let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if you believe every person deserves respect regardless of the uniform they wear or the job they do, hit that like button before you go. It genuinely helps this channel grow. And it helps more stories like Grace's find the people who need to hear them. Grace stayed on with the Choi family, not because she needed the work anymore. Doo-Han had made sure of that, though she'd fought him hard on every offer he made. But because those children had become as much her family as any blood ever had. Some evenings she'd sit on the back porch with Mina in her lap, teaching her small phrases in Korean. Watching the sun go down slow and golden over a life she'd fought harder than anyone in that house would ever fully understand to keep. And if you ever find yourself in a room, quick to judge someone by their uniform, their accent, their quiet, remember Grace Williams, kneeling on that floor with broken glass in her hands, saying nothing, while carrying more strength and history than anyone around her could have possibly imagined. Because the truth is simple even when the world makes it complicated. Respect costs you nothing. But disrespect, given to the wrong person at the wrong moment, can cost you absolutely everything.